Good morning. Good morning. Nice to see all your faces this morning. We would like to do a special welcome to our Beth Abraham brethren who came to join us today. Thank you for coming. I just have a couple of announcements. This is the last brunch of this calendar year, but the 5th of January, we will have our old friend Richard Saracen back, and he will be talking about new old sources for reform, liturgical creativity, Geniza prayers from the land of Israel. And at this point, let me bring up Sarah Faust, who will introduce our speaker today, which is Dr. Gary Zola.
Good morning, everybody. It is my true honor to introduce Dr. Zola. He's spoken here numerous times before. He's always very enlightening and engaging. I'm sure our talk today will be really great. His bio is quite extensive, so I'm going to give you some highlights, but if anyone wants the full blurb, just let me know afterwards. Gary Philip Zola is the Executive Director Emeritus of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives and the Edward M. Ackerman Family Distinguished Professor of American Jewish Experience and Reformed Jewish History at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati. He has served the College Institute where he received both his rabbinic ordination and his PhD in American Jewish history for more than 4 decades. Dr. Zola has numerous publications, has received extensive awards, again, lots of details. On May 17th, 2023, President Joe Biden appointed Dr. Zola to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, which serves as a governing board of trustees of the United States Holocaust Museum and Memorial in Washington, D.C. President Barack Obama appointed Dr. Zola on 3 separate occasions to serve as a member of the U.S. Commission for the Preservation of American Heritage Abroad, an independent agency of the federal government.
Why not?
All right. Dr. Zola and his wife Steffi reside in Cincinnati. They have 4 grown children and 5 grandchildren. The topic today is ballot box priorities. Dr. Zola.
All right, everybody able to hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good, good. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's good to see you. It's also great to be back. I've lost count how many times that I have been here at Temple Israel for the lecture, the Sunday morning lecture, but it's many times. And it's nice to hear that my colleague and my teacher, Rabbi Saracen, is going to be here at the next lecture. You're in for a treat. Like any good clergy person, before I begin, I have a few words to say. So, first of all, I just want to say how happy I am to be here at the Temple. It's been an important part of my rabbinate because not only have I had the privilege of addressing the Sunday morning brunch periodically, and I mentioned to somebody that I'm intending to, maybe the next time, assuming that I might be invited back at some point, I might give a history of the lecture and who spoke and what they said. Might be very interesting. But my connection to the synagogue really begins with a wonderful man who meant a great deal to me, and that's your rabbi, Rabbi Bloom, of blessed memory, and who became a mentor and a friend. And I'm happy to say that your current rabbis, both of them, were my students. And so I feel a nice bond. It was wonderful to see Tina and her crew. I also know that there are a number of people in the audience who I've known for some time. You know, your president, just reminded me that she heard me speak in 1994 in Columbus, Ohio. And I said, how could that be? I'm not that old. But yeah, you know, I don't know if you know, do any of you know what the president of the Jewish congregations were called during the colonial period? Does anybody know? Of course, this is before the Constitution, and therefore presidents were not referred to as president. That term was not used. Anybody know what term was used for the leader of the, there were 5 congregations in existence before the republic came into existence. So we had 5 presidents at least. Actually, by the time the Constitution came along, we had 6 congregations. Nobody knows. Okay, so here's your first lesson for today, and that is the president was referred to by the Hebrew term, the Parnas. The Parnas. Does anybody know how you might translate the word Parnas in English? Parnasa, Parnasa, right, that's Yiddish, Parnasa, yeah, of course, and that could be a female president, but of course there was no such thing, but, yes, Parnasa is, so a free translation might be the person responsible for the money, right? For making sure that the thing runs, right, and there's a livelihood. But you wouldn't want to use that Hebrew term back in the colonial period, right? I mean, none of the non-Jews, you were a tiny minority, nobody would know what you're talking about. It would sound very, very odd. So you had to translate into some appropriate English word. And so they borrowed the custom of English renderings from England, and the Parnas in those days in English was referred to back in the colonial period as the warden. The warden. And I have not met a president yet who hasn't urged us to reinstate that terminology. So thank you for your service. Okay. Last thing I want to say, friends, is Mitch, who and I have we have a bond that goes back many, many years. We're just talking about the current state of Reform Judaism. You know, when the early days of this lecture began, one of the sources of your lecturers that you could always depend upon was the Hebrew Union College. You had a great resource in Cincinnati, Ohio, with leading world-famous teachers who were known all over the world, and you could call them up. And if you planned ahead, they could drive 45 minutes, and here you were. Of course, you realize all of that is now a blessed memory. And I just want us to all think about what has been done to us by the coasts. And it's a serious problem. The reason I was not ready to step aside from my position. I was mentioning to Mitch, it's the only time in my whole life I was happy to be 65, because I would not continue to direct the American Jewish Archives or to teach at an institution that's lost its way. 150 years this year, in the year 2025, will mark 150th anniversary of the founding of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, and for 75 years before it merged and saved the life of the Jewish Institute of Religion. Before that merger, it sustained liberal Jewish life in America and North America. And this is the gratitude that has been shown for it. I've invented a term, I call it coastal condescension. That's exactly what we have. So friends, thank you for your therapy. I hope it's not, you won't charge me. Now today, I'm going to give you a talk that I worked up in preparation for the elections. I don't write on politics, American Jewish politics, that's not my specialty, but I do know a bit about the history of Jewish life in America. So I'm going to provide you today with some insight into the history of Jewish voting in America. And I will, at the end, bring it to the present day. And although I'll be talking at you a little for a period of time, I'm going to welcome any questions along the way. Just put your hands up. Don't wait till the end. You may be disappointed. There may not be an end. We may have it. And if it's too painful for you to cast your eyes in my direction while I'm talking, because of my miserable countenance, I have slides for you to look at while I speak, okay? So let's begin. Philip Roth's best-selling alternative history is titled The Plot Against America. That book was published in the year 2004. Just interested, have any of you read that book? One. Okay. So I'll explain. This is a historical novel, or what we might call historical fiction. It takes place in the 1930s, which, as you know, was a very unsettling decade leading up to the outbreak of World War II. And most American Jewish historians would characterize the decade of the 1930s as the high watermark for anti-Semitism in America. And we'll just have to see whether our current status will outdo the 1930s. It's a little too soon to make that decision. The 1930s, of course, is a time when anti-Jewish rhetoric emanated from the likes of these individuals: Henry Ford, the Dearborn Independent, Father Charles Coughlin and his Sunday radio show, and of course, the great aviator, Charles Lindbergh, who was the first leading spokesman, popular spokesman for the America First initiative back in the 1930s. Now, all of these people unnerved the Jewish community in the 1930s. And the book, The Plot Against America, is an opportunity to re-examine the fears that gripped the American Jewish community during the 1930s. But I thought of that book because it simultaneously invites us to reflect on our own political anxieties, our own place as Jews in the American community. Now, although many Jews fiercely denounced the manifestations of anti-Semitism during that tumultuous period of the 1930s, there were other Jews who worried that America actually might be in the process of abandoning its founding ideals and embracing a pro-Nazi culture right here in America. And if you want to gauge that level of fear that existed in the 1930s, you just need to buy and read this book, published in the year 1943 by an author named John Roy Carlson. That was not his real name. His real name was Arthur Derunian. And he wrote a bestseller, widely read in the 1940s, titled Undercover: My 4 Years in the Nazi Underworld of America. And when you read this book, you will see that there is little doubt that there were a whole array of underground Nazi agents and anti-Semitic plots in the 1930s. Mr. Darunian's book documents this, and it prompted many Americans and American Jews to worry that these Nazis embedded in places all over America, including Cincinnati and Dayton, might succeed in toppling American democracy and replacing it with a system of government that would make America inhospitable to Jewish life. So, the book, The Plot Against America, imagines, envisions what America might have looked like if Charles Lindbergh had actually decided to run for president and successfully defeated Franklin Roosevelt to become America's 33rd president. So when you read this book, you enter into a dystopian America wherein the Jews experience in this imaginary world religious oppression and government-sponsored programs that leave Jews feeling uncomfortable in the United States, and in fact even coercing some Jews to actually give up Judaism, to abandon their Jewish identification and practice. If you're sitting there thinking right now, gee, there's a misty familiarity between what Zola is talking about with regard to Roth's alternative history and real life contemporary events in America, events that have been occurring particularly since the year 2015. Although some might actually plot this trend back to 1994, when a movement began called the Contract with America, which proved at that time to be a watershed event for congressional elections and the behavior of Congresspeople in terms of working together. Now, according to a fairly recent poll conducted by none other than the American Jewish Committee, 2/3 of American Jews feel less secure in the United States of America today than they did a year ago. Nearly half say that their daily behavior has changed as a result of anti-Semitism. And before you dismiss this and say, gee, my behavior hasn't changed, think about what happened when all of us walked in the temple doors today. We all passed security, right? So many Jews believe that the current levels of anti-Semitism are actually comparable to the kind of ugly period that existed in the 1930s. That decade, which, as you know, culminated with the outbreak of World War II and such terrible bestial calamity that befell the Jews of Europe. Now, one of the fictional characters in Roth's novel is this man. Of course, this is an actor. This is an actor playing Rabbi Lionel Bengelsdorf. This rabbi is, in the novel, an enthusiastic supporter of Charles Lindbergh. And much to the chagrin of many of Roth's other fictional characters in the novel, this rabbi, Jewish leader, actually plays a pivotal role in helping the charismatic aviator capture the presidency. Now think about this, the idea that a prominent Jewish leader, a religious leader, might actually campaign for the real Lindbergh in the 1930s, who spoke out in such a way against the Jewish people, who was the spokesman for the ideas of America first. This will strike some of us as being incredulous. And yet, it is also vaguely familiar to current events. And of course, history, American Jewish history, reminds us that there really are many, many historical examples of political challenges and controversies that challenge the assumption that we all, as a Jewish community in America, agree today or in the past on what needed to be done. In fact, friends, there have been instances when Jews voted for candidates, even presidential aspirants, whom many other Jews believed were not likely to promote the interest of their Jewish co-religionists. And this socio-political dilemma is a dilemma that has bedeviled American Jewry ever since the antebellum period. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, the antebellum period means the period preceding the Civil War. The question is, should Jews think of what is best for America or for what is best for the Jewish people when they go into the voting booth? And this query, which we talked about leading up to November 5th this year, is not a new question. That's the lesson for today. In fact, this query has captured, this dilemma is expressed in how I sort of titled the talk, and that is, what is our identity? Are we Jewish Americans or are we American Jews? In other words, which word is modifying the noun? And how does that play itself out in the ballot box? Now, just as an aside, please don't think that I'm pointing out something that's unique to the Jewish community. We're talking about our particular approach to this problem, but all sorts of what we call today identity politics communities do the same thing. Just think about, in the last election, the discussions about how the Black community should vote, or how the Hispanic community should vote, or how the gay and lesbian and transgender community should vote. So this is not just a Jewish custom, but we have, as always, our own unique approach to this. And just to show you that even the majority can talk this way, I cite for you former Vice President Mike Pence, who you will remember in 216, 215, 16, would constantly say in public that he approaches the elections with three ideas in mind. First, he is a Christian. Second, he is a conservative. And third, he is a Republican in that order. He didn't even mention America. Now, another piece of the background is that disdain, hatred for factional politics can actually be traced back to our founders of the nation, and the very beginning of the republic. This that we are currently experiencing has been anticipated by those who shaped and framed our Constitution. Take a look, go home, look up, do a Google search on President Washington's farewell address. It's all digitized, you can read it in your house. And you will see that in that famous farewell address delivered in the year 1796, President Washington warned his fellow citizens to be wary of political factionalism. He writes that the fledgling nation's future is in jeopardy if a time would arrive when a citizen's loyalty to a political party or a populist caucus took precedence over the citizens' feelings of duty to the nation as a whole, to America. And more importantly, if it were to overtake our commitment, people's commitment to the remarkable ideals that were set forth in the founding documents. And Washington, in his address, concluded that were such a trend to come to be, it would threaten the very survival of the republic. Now, with that background, let's take a look at the history. In the very earliest periods of American Jewish history, I'm talking about the colonial period, the revolutionary period, the early national period, we were so tiny, so insignificant, so small. We were literally 0.01% of the total population. Nobody gave a hoot what the Jews did in the ballot box because we couldn't make an impact. But all of that began to change in the 1840s. And the reason for that is, and you should all know this well, of course, when I speak in New York, which I rarely get to do because, New Yorkers, they have nothing to learn from anybody in the middle of the country. But you know that when you speak to New Yorkers, they'll all tell you that all the Jews came over to America in the 1880s and 1890s because they're all Eastern European Jews. But if I go to Cincinnati, and I dare say probably in this room too, there are people who trace their ancestry back to the 1840s and 1850s when the Central European Jews began to come over. And that's exactly what happened in a variety of cities, including Cincinnati, Ohio. The Jewish community had begun to grow large enough, and it was significant enough that in the 1840s and 1850s, that it gave rise to this dawning recognition that if Jews in these cities where Jews lived voted as a bloc, voted united, well, they might be able to affect the election, particularly if the election was close. And so it makes sense. It's not a surprise that it was during Abraham Lincoln's presidency that the notion, discussion, of a Jewish bloc vote, the Jewish vote, is first emerges into the national lexicon. Now, friends, I'm showing you something that only in the last 8-9 months has been discovered. This document is brand new. It was just published in the American Jewish Archive Journal. Brand new in the sense that somehow it had escaped the eyes of historians. But here it is in front of you. This is a rare, recently published document, and it is believed to be the first American Jewish political broadside wherein American Jews organize to advocate for the election of one presidential candidate. And in this instance, as you can see with your own eyes, we're speaking about none other than Rabbi Abraham Lincoln, right? Here you are looking at this image of a surviving broadside published by an organization titled the Jewish Union of Republican Association. The year is 1864. It carries the signature of 14 Jews, almost all of whom are living in the states of New York and Pennsylvania. And as you can see, they unmistakably appeal to their co-religionists, to their fellow Jews, to vote for Father Abraham Lincoln. Quote, as you see, the champion of freedom, the emancipator of the slaves, and the preserver of his country. Now, the news that there was an effort to support Abraham Lincoln in the northern Jewish community is nothing new to historians. What is new is the actual document that demonstrates this. But one of Abraham Lincoln's many Jewish political associates, and Lincoln, by the way, some of you know, I published a book in 2014 on Lincoln and the Jews. And Lincoln knew more Jews than all the 15 presidents who preceded him. And one of his friends, and someone he liked, was a podiatrist, a chiropodist by the name of Issachar Zachary. Mr. Zachary tended to the needs of several members of the president's cabinet. And of course, President Lincoln also had problematic feet, and he needed the services of a capable podiatrist. And so the cabinet members who were so happy with Dr. Zachary recommended him to the president. And so the president engaged him, developed a friendly bond with him. By the way, those of you who find this difficult to believe, I just call upon you, whether men or women, to think about your experiences whenever you get your hair cut or coiffed. We all talk to our therapists at that time, right? And we strike up friendly conversations. It's sort of a human instinct. And that's what happened with Lincoln. He became friends with the man who was trimming his toenails. And by the way, if you think I'm exaggerating, and that's a good instinct, you see here just one of a number of surviving endorsements that the president gave to Dr. Zachary. Now, if you want to know more about Dr. Zachary, you got to read my book. There's actually also a whole book now on Zachary that came out after my book, just on him. And he actually plays a very fascinating role in the Civil War. Lincoln will send him down into the South because he's Jewish, into New Orleans, which the Union had conquered by this time, and sends him into the New Orleans to win over the people of New Orleans to the side of the Union, because Zachary tells them there are a lot of rich and influential Jews in New Orleans. That's true. That was true. And he says, I know these people. They're my people. I can work with them. And so he's more than just a toenail trimmer, that's for sure. But what happens in 1864 is that Zachary throws himself wholeheartedly into the effort to re-elect Lincoln. He sort of enlists himself as Lincoln's campaign manager for the Jews. And he travels, Zachary does, throughout Pennsylvania and New York, electioneering for the president. And he pays focused attention on his Jewish co-religionists. In a letter that he writes to Lincoln, he says, as regards to the Israelites, I understand them well. Issachar Zachary hires campaign workers, and he also works to register voters who will vote for the president, all in the hope of establishing a block vote of Israelites who could tip the election in the North for Mr. Lincoln. Now, the Jews of Pennsylvania, Zachary assured the president in another letter, were all his supporters. Now, Zachary's activities, his insistence that he could persuade the Jewish community to cast the ballot for President Lincoln, that sparked an intense backlash in the Pennsylvania Jewish community. Prominent Jewish leaders wasted no time contradicting Zachary and discrediting his suggestion that the Jews were partial to Abraham Lincoln or to any political candidate for that matter. This man, Rabbi Samuel Meyer Isaacs, the Dutch-born American Jewish educator, philanthropist, newspaper publisher, and rabbi, he said, nobody is authorized to speak for our co-religionists on political questions. Israelites, as Israelites, said Rabbi Isaacs, have no politics. Samuel's son, who succeeded him as the editor of the Jewish Messenger in New York, Meyer Isaacs, he followed his father's thinking. And he said at the same time, there is no such thing as a Jewish vote. Now, many Jews agreed with this point of view. Let's move to the Midwest, where this man, Rabbi Liebman Adler, was at that time, 1864, he was the rabbi of the oldest Jewish congregation in Chicago. Some of you may know it. It's called Kehilath Ansher Maariv, KAM. And the rabbi informed his public that despite the deep pride he had in his Jewish identity, and I quote, "It is different when I take a ballot in order to exercise my rights as a citizen. Then I am not a Jew, but I feel and I act as a citizen of the Republic." Henry Greenbaum, a banker from Chicago, prominent Jew who was a hero of the Civil War. He raised his own regiment to fight for the Union. He concurred with his rabbi, Rabbi Adler, and he asserted that his Jewish religion taught him always to regard all men as his brothers, and that is how he voted. Some of you know the name of one of the most famous and distinguished Reform rabbis in all of American history, Rabbi Emil G. Hirsch of Sinai, Chicago. He asserted in his newspaper, politically, Jews are divided. There is no solid Jewish vote. Most of the Jews have no political aspirations. They are loyal citizens. Now, friends, it was in the election of 1868 when Ulysses S. Grant became the presidential candidate for Lincoln's Republican Party. This is probably the first time in American history that Jews publicly and vociferously debated whether or not it was good for the Jews or good for the Americans, whether this dichotomy, whether they should vote as a group, keeping their Jewish identity in mind, or with American status or citizenship in mind. And this debate over Ulysses S. Grant arose because by the time he ran for president, which of course was 3 years after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, it was well known in the Jewish community that President Grant, then General Grant, during the war in the year 1862, had issued a very famous order. And that order is referred to by historians as Grant's General Orders Number 11. This remarkable order, issued, as I say, on December the 17th, 1862, is an order wherein the general, as you can see, expels all of the Jewish citizens living in the military department of Tennessee. That was his area. He was in charge of the military department of Tennessee, and that included the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, parts of Mississippi, and parts of Alabama. 1862. What happened? Grant had lost his patience with the persistent efforts of what were called in those days profiteers. Profiteers, friends, were those who would go down into the South, sneak into the South. They would make personal, private business dealings with Southerners. They would purchase up very important commodities, such as cotton, and then they would furtively bring that contraband up to the north where it could be sold as a profit. And this was a serious problem, and it is true that many Jewish merchants engaged in this unpatriotic activity. But not all of the profiteers were Jews. But somehow, apparently, it seems that the general was so exasperated and so flustered and flummoxed that he conflated the term profiteer and Jew as if they were one and the same. And so he issued an order in which he specifically expels all the Jews from his military territory. And that included men, women, and children. And this injunction, friends, constituted the only time in all of American history that Jews were banished from American territory. Now, as some of you may already know, this calamity lasted barely 3 weeks. Because a great hero from Paducah, Kentucky, it's another thing I like to remind the Jews of New York. A great hero from Paducah, Kentucky, one of the very few communities that actually suffered expulsion, made his way all the way to Washington, D.C. from December the 17th. He was standing in front of Abraham Lincoln on January the 3rd, 1863. And he presented his expulsion orders to the president. The president initially would not believe it was true. But when he saw the man's expulsion orders, according to the man's brother, the president looked at him and said, well, I see the Jews have been expelled from the happy land of Canaan. And according to the man's brother, Mr. Caskell responded by saying, that is correct, Father Abraham, which is why we have come unto your bosom for protection. And Lincoln said, that protection you shall have. And he revoked Grant's order immediately. So in 1863, this was over before many of the Jews knew it had even happened. But as you can see from this newspaper, the story lived on, and Grant's order eventually became known all over America. And so by the time the president, Grant decided to run for president, many Jews were appalled and insulted by what Grant had done, and they concluded that Ulysses S. Grant, as great a general as he may have been, was a Jew-hating bigot. And even though he was the figure who led the Union to victory on the battlefield, and despite the fact that Grant, was leading now the party of Lincoln, the martyred president who freed the slaves and who stood for the preservation of Lincoln's vision of Reconstruction, and even though Grant represented a party which stood for freedom and equality and union, many Jews refused to forgive Ulysses S. Grant, and they were determined to keep him out of office. They wanted to vote against the famed hero of the Civil War. And you will be happy to hear that one of Ulysses Grant's most vigorous and vociferous opponents was none other than the sainted founder of our movement, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise of Cincinnati. As you can see, he said, he said in the Israelite, and I'm quoting, if wrong is wrong, he who defends it is wicked. Wise denounced Jews who did not have the courage to stand up for Jewish dignity. He continued, men of principle and character have a solemn duty to speak, to resent indecencies, to plead their cause, and to stand up firmly and decidedly for their rights and their principles. But you remember Rabbi Liebman Adler from Chicago at KAM? Well, he disagreed with his colleague, Rabbi Wise. He disagreed vigorously. And in one of the most remarkable statements, explanations as to why Jews should vote for Grant despite what happened, Rabbi Adler argued in the most unbelievable language that Judaism's ethical heritage enjoined him to prioritize America and America's welfare over and against any kind of Jewish particularistic issue. listen to the memorable words that Rabbi Liebman wrote. If that party, in whose hands I believe the welfare of the country, so far as the advancement of human rights was concerned, was the safest, were to place a Haman at the helm of state, and if the opposite party, whose non-existence I believe would be better for humanity and my country, were to place the Messiah at their head, make Moses the Chief Justice, and call the patriarchs to the cabinet, I would say, prosper under Haman, my fatherland. And here you have my vote, even if all the Jew in me mourns. So for the remainder of the 19th century and during the first few decades of the 20th century, no political presidential contest ever witnessed the kind of public inter-Jewish disputing, just like what happened during Grant's presidential run. But bringing us back to the plot against America, the upsurge of anti-Semitism in the 1920s and the 1930s, and then sprinkling on top of all of this, the growing significance of Zionism and the concern about the establishment of a Jewish state in the 1930s, all of this, which would eventually, as you know, culminate in the creation of a Jewish state in 1948, all of this provoked similar controversies in the 1930s and 40s, and the controversies were over this simple question: should Jews prioritize their own Jewish interests when they go to the ballot box? Or alternatively, should Jews keep their own political sensibilities intently focused on what one 20th century rabbi described as the image, the ideas, and the aspirations of America itself? Now, I know you'll remember this man. In the 1950s, most American Jews did not think very highly of Senator Joseph McCarthy. As you probably recall or have read, McCarthy was a provocative political figure. He created a great deal of disunity in America. He promoted unsubstantiated Senate investigations that resulted in the destruction of the careers of many Americans, including especially a number of Jewish Americans, whom he accused of being communists. But you may not know, though it is a fact, and as my 8th grade health teacher used to say, I want you to hear it from me and not learn this in the streets. McCarthy had an impressive circle of Jewish backers. In addition to the well-known role that Jews such as Roy Cohen and G. David Schein played in the Army McCarthy hearings of 1954, McCarthy's tactics provoked the creation of an organization called the American Jewish League Against Communism. This was founded in the year 1948, and it was led by this rabbi, a graduate of the Jewish Institute of Religion, Rabbi Benjamin Schultz. And in 1954, in the month of August, this organization created a fundraising dinner that was held at the Astor Hotel in New York City. The keynote speakers were none other than Senator McCarthy and Roy Cohen. 2,000 Jews in the city of New York gathered in the Astor Hotel to listen to these two American politicians. And when Rabbi Schultz introduced Senator McCarthy with the words, "He is my hero," the crowd, according to Time magazine, gave Rabbi Schultz a standing ovation. Another more recent example has to do with President Jimmy Carter. Some of you remember that President Jimmy Carter's unapologetic self-identification as a born-again Christian during his rise to political prominence raised concern within the American Jewish community. Now, he was an interesting figure because he positioned himself as a reasonable political moderate who was not on the radical side, but not a conservative. He advocated legalizing marijuana. He spoke in favor of adopting the Equal Rights Amendment. He favored preserving the right of women to decide their own future in terms of abortion. He even supported gay rights, and he promoted local control over the federal programs such as welfare and health insurance. But in spite of all of these appealing qualities, Carter's repeated discussion of his religious fervor left many Jews in the 1970s wondering whether this Democrat could be trusted to respect the Jeffersonian wall that separated church and state. Now, at the onset of the battle for the White House in 1975 and 76, you may recall that one of his opponents was a very popular senator who became extremely popular in the Jewish community because of his support for Soviet Jews, and that was Senator Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson. And the two of these men happened to be in Miami Beach on the very same day campaigning for the state's Democratic Party nomination. According to the newspapers, Jackson spoke at what was at the time Miami's premier conservative synagogue, Temple Emmanuel. Carter was invited to speak at a nearby yeshiva, a Jewish day school. Jackson, according to the newspaper, drew standing room only. It was a crowd that packed the sanctuary that sat 2,000 people. He also had overflow into the downstairs hall and even the semicircular upper balcony. According to the newspapers, the crowd cheered Jackson's every word. But there were only a few Jews who came to hear President Carter at the yeshiva. According to the newspaper, they listened to the candidate politely, but warily. And after the event, according to the correspondent, he made his way to several in the audience and was repeatedly told that no one was quite ready yet to publicly endorse Jimmy Carter. Now, as we bring ourselves to the present day, a new chapter in this history I've been describing was written on November the 5th, 2024. And all of us were involved in the debates that led up to the national elections. The Pew Research Center published a survey in 2020. And I suspect that their results are pertinent to this day. That you can see that they have revealed that 7 in 10 Jewish adults identify with or lean toward the Democratic Party. But the Pew Center survey simultaneously emphasizes that the political profile of America's Orthodox Jewry, which is only a small portion of the totality of American Jews, but the Orthodox Jewish community is virtually, in its political disposition, the reverse of the other part of the Jewish community, with more than 60% of Orthodox Jews saying that they are politically conservative, and 75% say they either belong to the Republican Party or they're inclined to vote for the Republican Party. In the year 2020, 81% of America's Orthodox Jews reported that they approve of President Trump's job performance during his first term in office. And since we now know the results, of the election on November 5th, we can assume that that number certainly did not go down. Friends, it is very difficult to unravel the political Gordian knot that has come upon American Jewry in the wake of the horrid events that took place on October the 7th, 2023. And simultaneously, of course, the painful, upsetting hostilities that overtook the Middle East and continue to this day. Again, turning to another part of the poll, in 2020, 8 in 10 US Jews reported to the Pew's research that caring about Israel was an essential or an important part of their Jewish self-view. Nearly 6 in 10 American Jews confess to having an emotional attachment to the state of Israel. However, this is 2020. 1 in 10 Jews confessed in 2020 to being supporters of the BDS movement. That's the boycott and disengagement and sanction movement that we've heard so much about. And although we do not have, as far as I know, a recent survey of 2023 or 2024 subsequent to October 7th, I think it's logical, based on just observation, that if 1 in 10 Jews were supporters back in 2020 before the calamity that occurred on October 7th began, I think it's reasonable to assume that there might actually be even more today. If you please.
Do you have any information on the 1 in 10? How many by age group?
Yes. It is definitely a generational issue, without question. That's been established. Now, after the election, and we're only, 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks after the election, already a war of Jewish pollsters has broken out. A politically conservative consultancy and analytics firm named WPA Intelligence, that's the name of this consultancy and analytical firm, it released a survey of exit poll data last week, and this group concluded that 32% of American Jews voted for Mr. Trump. If this was the case, this would then be the largest percentage since 1988, when George H.W. Bush defeated Michael Dukakis. However, a group called the National Election Pool, which is a firm that produces exit poll results for a consortium of major news organizations, their findings contradict the WPA intelligence findings. According to their study, almost 80% of the Jews said, and the exit polling, that they voted Democratic. Compared, now that would mean approximately 20 or 21% of American Jewry voted Republican. That's a big difference between 21, 22% and 36, 35%, whatever. And the politically liberal Israel lobby, we all know, J Street, they too issued an exit poll finding, and they too agree that the numbers were closer to 20% of American Jews. Was there a, yes, if you please.
Was there a difference between men and women in terms of Judaism who voted Democrat?
That's a good question, and you have stumped. I don't have the answer to that. And in terms of I think you mean in the exit poll. And the exit polling, as I'm stressing, is right now just being promulgated. And what my point is, already Jews are politically carping at each other, with some Jews saying, oh, Mr. Trump received X amount, and we know we're right. And other Jewish organizations saying, that's baloney. The Jews did not change their typical disposition. And it's going to be, I think, quite some time before we have the facts.
Thank you.
But that may come out soon. Yes, please.
I know a couple of Jewish men that said that they were voting for whoever was going to make Israel safer. In the exit polls, and they found that 30 or 20 was Israel any of the reasons why they voted for Trump?
Well, I'm going to turn to that right now.
Okay.
Okay, that's how I'm finishing.
Okay.
So hear me out, and then if you want to push, go right ahead. Okay. Much more relevant to the topic at hand that I've been focusing on, however, is the interpretation that the WPA intelligence organization offered together with their statistics. Because they write, and you can read it in the internet, and I'm quoting, there is a growing political gap between disengaged and secular people of Jewish ancestry and those actively engaged with the Jewish religion. The study or the poll, they are asserting that Mr. Trump's Jewish backers, those who endorsed him, are, quote, those Jews who live the most Jewish lives and reside in the most Jewish communities. And this assertion, which of course is an incomplete analysis, because we know that Mr. Trump has growing cohorts of Jewish supporters who are not members of the Orthodox community. We know that. And all you need to do is go into these components of our Jewish community, which we may not have a lot of in the middle of the country, but if you talk to the Jews from Persia, from Iran, who are largely located in New York and in Los Angeles, or if you talk to Jews who came to this country and have naturalized, but they're from the former Soviet Union, or if you speak to Israeli Americans, meaning Israelis who have come to live in America and are now American citizens and also Israelis, retaining their citizenship, they are clearly, it's been demonstrated, they're skewed towards Mr. Trump. So this comment that the WPA intelligence organization makes is not accurate, because we know that there are even other groups besides the Orthodox community that is very much inclined to vote for Mr. Trump and did vote for Mr. Trump. Now, if we could firmly determine, if it was possible to determine that 80% of American jury did indeed vote for Kamala Harris on November 5th, if that was true, and we just don't know yet, but that's what some assert, this would then challenge the claim that American Jews have been growing increasingly wary of the Democratic Party. And that has happened. Many prominent anti-Israel voices in the Democratic Party have provoked concern among Jews all across America. For example, just before the election, Rabbi Amiel Hirsch, Rabbi Hirsch is the senior rabbi of New York City's very prominent synagogue called Stephen S. Wise Free Synagogue. Rabbi Hirsch, by the way, is probably the most prominent Zionist rabbi in the Reform movement today. He is an outstanding preacher, a brilliant rabbi, and a deeply committed Zionist leader. And he wrote this on his social media apps. He says, "Neither I nor our synagogue engage in partisan politics. So allow me to express a nonpartisan word to all our friends in elected office from the Democratic Party. Do not take American Jews for granted." This was before the election. The assumption being that concern about anti-Israel would push many Jews to vote Republican. But if the statistics show that there's been no such movement, what does that mean? Hirsch went on to say that he had conversed with many American Jews in the past few months who have surprised him with the anxiety that they expressed about recent developments in the Democratic Party, and they perceive that the Democratic Party is becoming increasingly hostile toward Israel, increasingly tolerant of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in its own ranks. Well, friends, it's time to wrap up. In the decades immediately following World War II, American Jewry, its institutions, its teachers, its spokespeople, viewed politics both at home and abroad primarily through a universal lens. In other words, for decades, the Jewish political agenda in America consisted of an impulse to advocate always for the nation's noble ideals. The thinking was, if we voted for those who would enrich and enhance the American pursuit of democracy, both at home and abroad, if they would fight these people for justice, for righteousness, for all people, then ipso facto, we would be safeguarding our own Jewish future. In America, this was the thinking, that lived up to its founding ideals would offer the best protection for the American Jewish community. Yet, the 21st century is a different epoch altogether. And our national culture, as we all know, has changed radically in our lifetime, before our very eyes. And we are all today influenced by factors that didn't exist even 25 years ago, such as social media and the development, which is today almost permanently ingrained, which I refer to as ubiquitous do buy it. That is a $25 expression for persistent doubt that the truth is being told. And of course, an unapologetic tribalism, which has infected every aspect of American life. So friends, today, in today's siloed, skeptical, and splenetic America, Jews, just like all other Americans, may be much more inclined to give Jewish political perspectives and Jewish political interests affirmative action over universal concerns for the common good. And the debate among Jews over the candidates seeking presidential office in the last election constitutes an illustration of this battle, this debate over are we American Jews or Jewish Americans in the ballot box. It is a new era today. Here's a few examples of that. Analyzing why some American Jews prefer one candidate over another in that last election of 2.5 weeks ago, we find that the boundaries that once divided who voted like a Jewish American and those who voted like American Jews, that boundary seems to be very ambiguous today. And we can only surmise that unyielding societal division and intractable political partisanship within the Jewish community has produced champions of both candidates who insist that their contender is the best choice for the interests of the Jewish people and the American nation. In other words, if it's good for America, it's ipso facto good for the Jews and vice versa. To illustrate this very briefly, consider these examples. This is Brandon May. He is a young, fervid Jewish Republican activist from Wisconsin. And just prior to the election on November 5th, he wrote a lengthy essay, which I read. It was published in Newsweek, a week, maybe two before the election. And in addition to his assertion, this young man's assertion that Mr. Trump had already proven and demonstrated in his first term that he was an ardent supporter of the Jewish people and the Jewish state, Malley also adds in his essay that America itself, if that weren't even the case, would be better off with Trump. He wrote, quote, "President Trump believes in peace through strength, which is the strongest possible deterrent to global oppression." Now, if you don't know this man, that means you're not an Orthodox Jew. Because this man, who is what we call in Jewish lingo a Baal Tshuva, is a Jew who refound his traditional Jewish religion. He is the most popular, at least one of the most, probably the most popular Jewish influencer on social media for the Orthodox Jewish community. His name is Beryl Solomon. And in addition to Mr. Trump's pro-Israel credentials, Solomon has argued on his podcast and his various social media outlets that there are many, many other reasons besides his Israel credentials to vote for Mr. Trump. He did this right, leading up to the election. And his positive qualifications, according to Mr. Solomon, are he believes in God, he is pro-business, he supports the police, and he's an advocate of the strong military. Now, the same thing could be said on the other side. This is Esther Sperber. Esther Sperber was born in Israel. Today, she is a prominent architect in New York City. She wrote an article just about the same time these folks were writing, a few weeks before the election. I read it in the Cleveland Jewish Voice. And she writes, and here it is for you to read along with me, about Kamala Harris. We share a concern for the state of Israel and for the safety of the Jews of the United States. But she goes on to argue that the Democratic candidate is not just a champion of Israel, but she has merits election because what she stands for would be the best for America too. And here it is. Vice President Harris shares many of my values, including an unflinching commitment to reproductive freedom and an unshakable respect for the dignity of all people. The Biden-Harris presidency prioritized clean energy and the Inflation Reduction Act and rebuilding America's infrastructure. The child tax credit cut child poverty in half, and their administration added 7.9 million jobs. But even for those who do not prioritize these policies, Kamala Harris is a person you can trust. She's conscientious, responsible, and defends the rule of law. And the noted Jewish newspaper editor and publisher, Gary Rosenblatt, captured this tension in such a clever turn of phrase that I wanted you to read it along with me. He wrote just recently, "How ironic and confusing that Democrats appear to be outspoken against anti-Semitism and softening on Israel, while Republicans enthusiastically support Israel, but seem to tolerate or ignore anti-Semites." Friends, the prophet Jeremiah immortalized these timeless and timely words of wisdom. V'dirshu et shalom ha'ir, asher higleiti etchem shama. V'hitpalalu ba'adad el Adonai, ki vishloma yeh lachem shalom. What does that mean in English? It means pursue the welfare of the city where you are situated. Meditate on its behalf, for if it is at peace, you too will be at peace. Easier said than done, Mr. Jeremiah. American Jewry is not of one mind regarding what is best for our country and for the Jewish community. And my teacher and friend, Professor Jonathan Sarna of Brandeis University, he summed the matter up as succinctly and effectively as possible when he wrote these words: "The tensions inherent in the term American Jew, or if you wish, Jewish American, embracing responsibilities to our country on the one hand, and to our fellow Jews on the other, these tensions heighten the challenge of casting a presidential ballot." I think we ought to consider the memorable religious political ideology that the famous Rabbi Stephen S. Wise repeatedly asserted when he would describe this spiritual tension with which he lived as an American and as a Jew. Wise would always tell audiences the following: I have two religions. One is the religion of the Jewish people, and the other is the religion of American democracy. I will live and die by both. Many, perhaps most American Jews identify or can identify with Rabbi Wise's belief in two faiths because, like our American Jewish forebears, it's quite likely we will all continue to face these competing values and ideals, both as Americans and as Jews. And as it has been with our forebears, we will have no choice but to lend ballot box support to candidates who share their commitment to the noble ideals enshrined in the American Constitution, out of which has emerged a nation that has nurtured what historians categorize as the most dynamic, influential, and remarkable Jewry in all of diaspora history. American Jews will continue to nurture their Jewish faith and concomitantly their faith in American democracy. Thank you so very much for your kind. Thank you. Now, I do know that my teacher, Dr. Marcus, who, by the way, spoke here on a number of occasions, used to always say that the mind can endure only as much as the tushy can tolerate. So I don't wish to overstay my welcome, but if there are any questions or comments, I'm more than happy to address them. Yes, ma'am.
How do you account for, I think in the last 2 weeks, the last report I saw, that the active individuals who are Nazi Americans marching throughout the country in different places since November 5th?
So I'm going to try to respond to your question, and if it's not adequate, you tell me.
Oh, sure.
Oh, good. Good. I'm not the least bit scared of the Jewish audience. I'm used to y'all. When I go to speak to a church, they're so polite. They listen so nicely. You go to a synagogue, you say, hi, I'm Gary Zola. That's not really your name. The answer to your question is the following, I think, or how I would answer your question is, it is a historical fact that anti-Semitism has existed in the United States of America from the minute the Jews arrived in 1654 till the present. There has never been, ever, a period when there's no anti-Semitism. What we're experiencing now is a resurgence in general in society of people feeling entitled to say and do what they feel like, and they don't give a damn whether it hurts other people's feelings. And that's not just about anti-Semitism, as you well know, it's about all sorts of things. So my response to you is that this is part and parcel of the American culture today. People saying and doing things that would be a bit more embarrassing. Not that they wouldn't happen, but they probably would happen more secretively in another era. And now a codicil to what I just said. I think all of us have to look all the time at whether or not, and I'm not saying this because I've taken a position on this, I just think in general, we must remember that there's all sorts of forces at work that want to excite us about everything that's happening, when not everything that's happening may actually be as important as the media might want to make it. So to go to your question and how it applies, should we really be worried about 20 crackpots who have, and maybe not even that many, who are doing something so stupid? Is that really, is that worthy of national news, where the governor, the president, everybody? Now, the reason it's become national news is because of, we're living at a time when news is ubiquitous, right? In other words, if it's not covered on cable, it's going to be covered on the internet. My kids sent that picture to me long before it came onto the news. They said, look what's happening, Dad, in Columbus. Because, that's how rapid it is. To make it even more problematic, and this, I don't think has gotten enough attention, but remember that news today is also a business, whether it's on social media or whether it's on cable or whatever. It's all about breaking news, right? It's all about, don't change the channel, stay put. Don't go anywhere else, stay with me. This is about making money. And right now, we're totally untethered in this. So how do you attract attention? Through controversy. How many people would be watching? You can pick your media outlet. It doesn't matter whether you say CNN, Fox. How many people are watching it? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to show you today, we're going to show you how bunnies reproduce. No, you can change the channel as quick as you can because they are looking to crank us up. Now, you have to be careful with what I just said, right? You have to be careful because sometimes we deserve to be cranked up. We should be cranked up. So we have to be thinking, sentient people. And that's another thing that really is getting me down. Now I'm departing for just a moment from my academic stature, and I'm telling you something that's personally irking me. And that is this disdain for learning that seems so pervasive in America. Friends, I'm going to be very straight with you. I went into the rabbinate for one reason only. I was attracted to the rabbis who I knew who were so brilliant. I wanted to be like them. I'd fallen short, but I'd tried. Really, I remember so distinctly my rabbi who I just spoke at his funeral. He was 97 years old, just died 3-4 weeks ago. I remember when I went there as a 10-year-old, I said to myself, this guy knows more than my teacher in junior high. And now, just in general, there's this talk about, intellectual elites and, we're all a bunch of eggheads and, there's a problem with that. I mean, doesn't anybody know that all of the founders of our country were all intellectuals? If you read McCullough's book on Madison, he studied for months in order to, he got his hands on every possible kind of government that existed, going back to the Greeks and in order to, to help to put together the Constitution. These people were knowledgeable people. Now, they were a little snobby, right? Because they thought if you weren't intelligent or if you didn't have, intellect, you couldn't vote, right? That's why, the Constitution originally said you had to be a landowner. In other words, you had to, you couldn't be a woman, right? What would a woman know, right? Okay, these things needed to be revisited, but they admired learning. I'm troubled by that, you can just pop off and say anything you want, even if it makes no sense. And to look down on people who study. Anyway, did I answer your question or no?
Part way, but I don't know if there's a true answer.
Well, there is, I'm just responding, in other words, I don't know, but I hope, in other words, just very, very directly. I think we live in a time when people can say what they want and they feel more unleashed and untethered. And that's, of course, not a good thing. But the counterbalance to that is, I'm wondering out loud with you, do we really need to get exercised by 20 lunatics? Are they really, is that the problem? I don't, and the codicil again to that is, we have to look each time, because there may be a problem. And in other words, we shouldn't instinctively simply dismiss everything as, well, these are just a few lunatics. That's not good either. But I question whether we should be cranked up every time something like this happens. That's all. Is that helpful? Okay. Yes, please.
I was told that nationally, in Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, there were only 30 individuals going into the incoming rabbinate classes.
I would say that's probably right.
And I've heard that's correct.
Yes.
So doesn't that, how are all these institutions like HUC in Cincinnati going to survive if nobody's going into the rabbinate?
Well, HUC in Cincinnati is dead. It is dead. They had killed it. They've murdered it. Murdered it. That's what they have done. And feel free to quote me. And but we're in deep trouble. We're in deep trouble. That is correct. This year's class going into JTS was 6 people. HUC, the great HUC, with all of its, I'm not sure we have 800 congregations, but let's pretend for a moment we do. 11. National.
And why do you think no one's going into the rabbinate?
Well, that's a difficult question. I have a number of theories, but I don't know the answer. But I'll tell you, first of all, we've done a horrible job in our movement, and I suspect in the others, in terms of lifting up the rabbinate as a calling and making it clear that we value rabbis. Many congregations do that, and they raise up rabbis. But many congregations spend their energy brutalizing their rabbi, imposing on their rabbi, throwing their rabbi out. And, young people watch this all the time. So that's one piece of it. Here's another piece. When I was ordained, which, as my kids like to remind me, was in Abe Lincoln's day. Doesn't seem that long ago to me, but, it was understood that I was going to become a rabbi and I use this word without any hesitation, to serve the Jewish people. And to this day, I've never been in the pulpit, ever. Never been in a congregation. But if someone called me up, a friend, and needed me for a funeral or wanted me to visit in the hospital, I don't say, you got your own rabbi, what do you call me for? That's my job. I'm a rabbi. younger people in general, and I understand this applies to law, to medicine, that the demand of that kind of lifestyle is not as appealing to the younger generation as the structure is very different today, right? In other words, there's still, when I was going to school, there were still people who, that one member of a marriage might work in a job that made it possible for the other to be a rabbi, more, forgive me for saying it, but more women were still prepared to be home, take care of children while the man well, all of that's now changing, and the need for both, the deservedness of both to pursue full careers makes it, it's hard enough to, to make a living, and when, you've got a job that says, well, we expect you to be at the synagogue at 9 a.m. until dinner time, then you go home for dinner for an hour, but then you have to come back because, every night or 3 nights a week because you have meetings, and that's the only time the people in your community can have meetings. And then, of course, you have your worship services, which you would want to go to anyway, but maybe not every single week, every day, but you've got to be there, and you've got to be there, on Shabbat morning. And then, of course, there's half the time there's some kind of community event you must be at. And then, of course, Sunday, when everyone else is playing golf, you're at religious school. And to boot, when it's your kid's birthday party, that's when someone is sick and needs you, and you've got to go if you want your job. And, on and on, you get called upon a year in advance to put something in your calendar, right? My son is getting married. Mazel tov, when is the bank? It's next year at this time. We want you to do it, so it goes into the calendar, no matter what's happening. This is a tough life. And then are the congregants, I'm asking you, are they grateful for this? Do they lift these people up? Many do, but many don't. That's another thing. Now I'm going to tell you something that's personal, and I could be wrong about this. I just fantasized about this. But you and I see the look on your faces. Most of you are from a similar generation as I am. So, that when we were younger, rabbis were much more revered than they are today, right?
Dr. Freeman.
Right, you didn't call him Rabbi Saul.
No.
Okay, that wasn't gonna fly, right? Everybody wore a robe, you were removed, there was a certain kind of dignity, reverence is a better word to use, right? Now, starting in the 1970s, just as I was approaching HUC, there was a movement against that. And I understand it, and I think that it has merit. In other words, we want to know our rabbis. We want to be able to relate to our rabbis. We want to be friendly with our rabbis. We don't want them to be, so removed. We want to feel like they're our friends, and we can identify with them. And so slowly the rabbi comes down off the bima, the robe comes off, and now it's Fred, Bill, Mary, Rabbi, and I'm just, I can't prove any of this. This is just another thought. If this is not a revered profession, if it's just a sort of a Jewish social worker, would the best and the brightest want to do this? No, I mean, you're a social worker, I'm talking about a Jewish social worker.
I am a Jew.
Yeah, I know you're Jewish, but I mean, you work just with Jews? Okay, all right, well, that's what I mean, because that's already a problem, as you well know. So, do we revere our rabbis? Maybe there's a better word. Revere is almost too much, but do we hold them in regard? Now, if you don't deserve it, like Dr. Marcus would say, you know, he used to always say, a rabbi has to be a good person, try to be a good person. Of course, if you're a schmuck, be someone else. But, you can't, obviously, can't be a rabbi if you're not a good human being. And that's a gift. But you also have to be learned. You have to be intelligent. You have to be studied. As you hear, I didn't just come and talk off the top of my head here. I mean, I prepared for you. That's my job. I'm supposed to be an expert in this area. So we have serious problems. You are right, very serious problems. And I'll tell you why. I'm going to prove to you right now. You'll all be persuaded by this. I've got 2,500 years of history that says any Jewish community that cannot duplicate religious leaders is doomed.
Mm.
You cannot show me any community ever, anywhere outside of the state of Israel where they survived on JCC film festivals, or or bowling leagues, or you name it. There's only one place where you go to become Jewish, and that's the synagogue. I mean, the Federation, American Jewish Committee, I'm members of all those things, the ADL, I mean, all that's important. But that's where they depend upon, largely, the synagogue has produced the commitment that these people then draw upon. And if that goes away, and that's where we're at right now. We're in serious problems. And people have been crying, leaders, myself. This is a serious problem for a decade, and they ignored it. How did they answer? The brilliant Hebrew Union College? Let's close down Cincinnati. Let's close down Cincinnati, because the Jews between the Rockies and the Alleghenies, they don't mean anything. They don't, you guys are a bunch of hicks who don't need anything.
Fran?
I'm going to change that. I'm in great sympathy with that. But I want to address the elephant in the room, and that's the misogyny that we saw in this election and in the narrowing of rights for women. And to me, that's in line with the fact that the conservatives or the Orthodox relate more to the Republicans. And this is a great concern.
Well, you brought me to, sort of the edge of, the limits of my ability to speak on that, because I am totally flummoxed. There seem to be quite a lot of women, including, all these people who go to college, and so there seems to be quite a lot of women who voted for the party that, brought an end to Roe versus Wade. It seems like it to me. I'm not blaming women. I'm just saying that we're going to have a number of women in the cabinet, right? That are coming up.
We're not bad.
They're not.
No, there are.
Yeah, there are going to be women, and these are intelligent, schooled people, but they're, all in. I don't know what to say about that. Now, in terms of the orthodoxy, that I can say something about, and that is that, you're right. And, this is part of, why I'm a liberal Jew. But they're not the majority of the American Jewish community. They're only, at best, 15–18% at best. So they're not, if we decided as a liberal community to be a little bit more energetic than we've been, My students used to all complain all the time about Chabad, you know. Chabad is everywhere, you know, Chabad is stealing our community, Chabad is picking our pockets, you know, Chabad. And I tell them, you stop picking on them. They're a success story. And the reason they're a success story is because, in my opinion, the reason they're a success story is because they believe in their mission. They call themselves the army of God. They are soldiers for what they believe in. And I'm as a historian of the Reformed Judaism, I'm gonna tell you that our pioneering reformers, Geiger, Wise, you could go on, they too believed in their mission. They believed in Reformed Judaism. They believed in what they were doing. They were passionate about it. Some of them really were brutalized as a result of their commitment to it. And I used to say to my students, you know, if you don't have that commitment, you're gonna never be able to persuade your people. Yes, please.
You brought up the vibe. Before I joined the temple last year, I was at the menorah lighting in County Country, and I met someone from the Chabad, and I told them that I was thinking of joining Temple Israel, and they replied, Reform Judaism isn't real Judaism. So I'm wondering, what's the best way to respond to someone who says something like that?
Well, you know, that surprises me. That surprises me because typically, now, Orthodox, you might hear that from an Orthodox community, but Chabad sort of specializes in welcoming, you know, not, in other words, they'll call a woman rabbi, they'll call you rabbis, you know, rabbi and all of that. They're, you know, because they don't get bothered by that because what they're, typically their approach, and the person who spoke to you that way is an outlier because typically, was it a rabbi who spoke that way or just a lay person?
I believe it was maybe like a cantor's wife. It was a woman.
Yeah, because you know, typically the rabbis will, because what's important to them is to welcome you in as a Jew, wherever you are, and then hopefully get you to into their mode of, you know, if that works for you. But you know, look, I can only tell you what I always say to my own kids and to all my students. I think my approach to Judaism is Torah true Judaism. It's the real true Judaism. Because you and I both know that the Judaism of Abraham is not the Judaism of Moses, and is not the Judaism of Maimonides, and it's not the Judaism of Spinoza. And you could go through, in other words, Judaism is constantly evolving. That is a historical fact. Now, those members of my brothers and sisters who want to tell us that everything was given on Mount Sinai just as it is today and nothing has changed, that is sort of like fake news. That's fake news. You know, if they want to say that, they can say that. If they want to believe the world was created in 7 days, they can believe whatever they want. But I'm observing the history of the Jewish people, and we have always evolved, and that's why Reform, at its best, is Torah true Judaism. It's bringing Torah to life in every day and in every era.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Let's thank Gary Zola for his presentation.
What? That don't fall up.
Yeah. My views is, I don't. Yeah.
Just the flat one.
It almost looked like, well, it got some of that.
Now it's getting, not getting good. How's that?
Yeah.
And I went to.